Hey guys! So today we're going to be talking about natural selection. So this is the process by which variations most suited to a local environment survive and leave more offspring. So from generation to generation, populations continue to change as they become better adapted or as their environment changes. So if we see in this little diagram here, we start off with individuals that can be gray, they can be dark gray, or they can be white. And then, for whatever reason, the darker colored ones seem to be better able to survive, reproduce, pass on their genes more frequently than the lighter colored ones. Maybe they're more camouflaged, maybe they can find a mate easier, whatever it might be. So as time goes on, they get darker and darker because the light ones with the light genes are dying off before they can reproduce and pass on their genes, whereas the darker colored individuals survive more frequently, reproduce more frequently, pass on their genes more frequently. And then we even have another mutation where we have an even darker color that's added, so a new phenotype that's added, and that one is even better able to survive. So now the lighter gray gets selected against, and the darker ones reproduce and pass on their genes more frequently. So that's the process of natural selection. One really important thing to remember with natural selection is one individual in their lifetime doesn't change. This happens over many, many, many generations where organisms better suited for their environment reproduce more frequently, pass on their genes more frequently, and those are the genes that become more common in the offspring. So there are three conditions that are necessary for natural selection to occur. First is called struggle for existence. So more individuals need to be born than can survive. And we'll look at each of these more in depth in a second. Second is that there is natural heritable variations among individuals of a population. So that means variations among the traits of individuals. And third is that there must be varied fitness among individuals, which leads to survival of the fittest. Okay, so let's first take a look at the struggle for existence. So essentially, there's more individuals born than can survive, which causes competition. So when individuals compete for resources like food, living space, mates, water, then it creates an environment where some are better able to survive and reproduce than others, right? So those individuals that are most fit to survive and reproduce in their environment are the ones that pass on their genes more frequently. And the ones who can't compete or are less able to compete with those stronger individuals don't pass on their genes as frequently. So it's the struggle for its existence. And now let's take a look at variations and adaptations. Okay, so individuals have natural variations among their heritable traits, their phenotypes, right? What you see, their physical traits. And some of those variants make organisms better suited for life in a particular environment than others. Any characteristic that increases an organism's ability to survive and reproduce is called an adaptation. That's a really important vocabulary word. So for example, skin color is something that varies among humans, right? It's a natural heritable variation. Heritable means it's inherited from our parents. And now that we live in a global world, it's not as important for our survival, but humans that lived closer to the equator, it was more beneficial for their survival to have darker skin because they wouldn't get sunburned or skin cancer as frequently. So that was an adaptation that humans evolved to have that lived close to the equator. As humans migrated north, it was beneficial to them to have lighter skin, so they were able to absorb more vitamin D from the sun. So that's all skin color is really. So now here's some examples of adaptation. So retractable claws in cats, claws that can retract, meaning they can go back in to their skin, so that makes them really quiet and super sneaky. and then when they're ready to pounce on their prey, they can extend those claws to catch their prey. So that's an adaptation that cats have. Some other adaptations, we can take a look here, are things like color, camouflage, mimicry. So this snake is poisonous while this one is not, so they mimic each other so that predators don't want to eat them. Also physiological function, so things like how an organism functions, like photosynthesis, for example, is an example of an adaptation that plants have. A behavior can also be an adaptation. So for example, a bird that's making himself look really big and scary when there's a predator around, that helps them survive and reproduce. So that's a behavioral trait that could be passed down from one generation to the next. All right, so now let's look at the last condition needed for natural selection to occur. This is called survival of the fittest, which means, well, first let's talk about what fitness means, right? It doesn't mean physically fit like what you think if you're going to the gym and you're strong and active. Fitness describes how well an organism can survive and reproduce in its environment. So it could mean the best camouflaged. It could mean the sneakiest or the quietest. It could mean the biggest and strongest, but not always. It could mean the smartest. So individuals with adaptations that help them survive and reproduce are said to have high fitness. So they'll pass on their genes more frequently than those with lower fitness. This is known as survival of the fittest. All right, so now let's look at an example of these conditions for natural selection playing out. So we've got an insect here, some kind of grasshopper, that's laying a bunch of eggs, right? And it lays way more eggs than it needs to because it's creating that competition among the offspring, right? So more, this is the struggle for existence. More are born than can survive, right? So it lays lots of eggs, hoping that a couple will survive. Then we've got natural variations among individuals. So there's variation in color among grasshoppers. Maybe some are more tan colored, some are more green colored. Then we have survival of the fittest coming into play, right? So the fittest, in this case, the grasshoppers that are more camouflaged and are better able to escape predators are the ones that survive, reproduce more frequently, pass on their genes more frequently. So that's how we get natural selection. So over many generations, we may end up with more green grasshoppers than tan grasshoppers because those are the ones that can survive and reproduce more frequently in their environment. Maybe if the environment changes and there's a drought and the grass is all burnt colored, maybe the tan ones will survive more frequently. So then there'll be a shift in which phenotype is the one that's seen more frequently in a population. All right, so now that we have a basic understanding of natural selection, let's talk about selection pressures. So selection pressure is any factor that affects an organism's ability to survive and reproduce in a given environment. So selection pressures can be negative, which means they decrease the occurrence of a trait, or positive, meaning they increase the occurrence of a trait. So things like competition for food, disease, climate, predators, those are all selection pressures that can drive natural selection in one way or another. So let's look at an example. There are a species of mice called rock pocket mice that live in the American Southwest that have changed due to their environment. So some are born tan, some are occasionally born blackish gray. In their environment, there was a lava flow that occurred a few thousand years ago that has affected the occurrence of both of these traits, right? So they normally live in a desert, so you would think that the tan phenotype is the one that is reproducing more frequently because they're better able to camouflage, blend in, hide from predators, right? This is a prey species. There's lots of owls and hawks and foxes and snakes that want to eat these guys. The black ones are very easy to see against the tan background. But when this lava flow occurred, it changed the environment so that Now we have a dark environment, so the darker mice are better able to survive, better able to hide from predators, so they're going to live longer, reproduce more frequently, pass on their genes more frequently than the tan mice in this particular environment. So depending on where these mice live, the populations are either more tan or more black, which is kind of cool. So scientists are studying these species of mice because they're so interesting, and because this is an example of natural selection that we can see with our own eyes. It's happening right in front of us in the past couple hundred years, which is pretty cool. Now we're going to look at 3 types of natural selection. First is called directional selection, and we're going to be looking at graphs as we look at these. So this is natural selection that favors one of the extremes of a trait in a population. Okay, so if we see a graph, right, so this dotted line here is representing the range of phenotypes of a particular population. So for these rabbits, they can be all different shades of tan, but the most common is this one in the middle, this kind of medium tan. Some can be lighter, some can be darker, but most are in the middle. Directional selection is showing a shift in one direction of these phenotypes. So for whatever reason, the darker individuals in this case were able to survive and more frequently than the lighter ones. Okay, maybe there was a change to the environment where the darker colored rabbits were able to blend in better, avoid predators more frequently. So those individuals were better able to survive, pass on their genes more frequently. So there was a shift in one direction of the phenotype. So this is natural selection that is occurring in one direction. The next type is called disruptive selection. So this is natural selection that favors both extremes of a trait in a population. So looking back to our rock pocket mice that we just talked about in the deserts of Arizona, they have a range of phenotypes from very light tan to very dark. Because of those 2 environments, right, the sandy desert environment and the lava rock environment, depending on where they live, we have a disruption in phenotypes. So the sandy colored mice do better in the sand environment, pass on their genes more frequently there. The darker colored mice survive better in the lava rock environment. Okay, so both extremes, right? Extremes are like the ones on the ends, the variations on the ends, are the ones that are reproducing most frequently. So eventually these mice will probably end up being 2 different species as they reproduce with each other more often than crossing their genes again. So this eventually leads to the emergence of new species. And then lastly, we have stabilizing selection. Make this up a little higher so we can see. Stabilizing selection is natural selection that favors the median trait, or the population, the trait more in the middle, right? So an example is human birth weight, right? Babies that are too big sometimes have trouble getting out of the mother and cause the mother and the baby to have problems, less likely to survive. Babies that are too small are less likely to survive. The ones right in that middle spot, right, 7 to 8 pounds, is the ones that survive and reproduce more frequently. So that increases and increases and increases and eliminates the phenotypes on the end. So we see a lot fewer 12-pound babies and 4-pound babies than we do 6, 7, 8, 9-pound babies. So that medium trait is the one that happens more frequently, right? It's more stable. If you think the word stabilizing, it means in the middle. Okay, so hopefully that helped us understand natural selection a little bit more. Please bring your questions to class and we'll go over this even more. See you next time.